Cynicism and gullibility may seem like they're really far apart, and in fact they seem like cynicism is trying to protect itself from gullibility. So it seems like they're in opposition. And yet, in this book, The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist, he claims they're not as far apart as they may seem. And in this section, he's looking at society and looking at the increasing rates of cynicism and gullibility and saying, actually, there's a connection here. So let me give you the quote. "My bet is that our age will be viewed in retrospect with amusement, as an age remarkable not only for its cynicism, but for its gullibility. The two conditions are not as far apart as they may seem." I want to unpack that a little bit. And as we do, I want to see, is there anything we can learn about vulnerability to manipulation and protection from manipulation? And in doing this, I want to use this book, The Matter with Things. It's also by Iain McGilchrist, which are, both books are an exploration of right hemisphere and left hemisphere of the brain. I have other videos that explain other things about the book and go into a deeper dive about those things. I'll link to that below. So where am I going with this? And we'll start out with some definitions of cynicism and gullibility, and then we'll look at the map and projector sort of lens that he gives us to think about this. And part of the reason, of course, is that maps are going to be one of the key levers that manipulators can use to manipulate people. Then we'll look at manipulation and how cynicism can play in with that. Then we'll look at the ways that cynicism actually chases away reality. And of course, you need reality if you're going to fight off manipulation. And we'll end with an example of how this might play out in the real world. And this particular example will actually help us to think about the way our society and the economy are co-evolving, the way that the growing rates of cynicism actually kind of feed in with some of the economic structures, and vice versa. Some of the economic structures might pull out a greater share of cynicism in the population through a particular means. What is cynicism? And cynicism is going to be an attitude of scornful or jaded negativity, especially a general distrust of the integrity or professed motives of others. It's a type of attention that a person pays to the world that projects something kind of yucky onto other people. And with McGilchrist, one of the things he says is that the type of attention we pay to the world is a moral act, and that it's a creative act. And in this case with cynicism, I think it's not just a creative act, it's actually also a destructive act. So it takes this projector, this thing it's projecting onto other people, and through that projector, it actually diminishes or destroys something that is there, or something that could exist in a relationship between people, but because of the cynical attitude, that possibility of that beautiful thing coming between them gets disintegrated. How should we define gullibility? And I'll define this as the tendency to believe something too readily and therefore to be too easily swayed by manipulation. Why does cynicism make somebody more vulnerable? And to answer that, we do need to bring in this map and territory analogy that goes along with his depiction of the right hemisphere and left hemisphere, where the left hemisphere is in charge of the symbolic, that includes language, but it's also about building models of the world, which I will call the map part of this a lens and a projector. The maps sort of help us focus on what we will actually see, what will come forward to us in the world we're looking at, but it also ends up projecting itself onto the world so that we see what is in our maps instead of what contradicts our maps. Whereas the right hemisphere of the brain, that's about the territory. It's about seeing the things that might be different from the maps we've already constructed. So why does cynicism make a person more vulnerable to manipulation? And the way I would explain this in terms of salience frames, where salience frame is the lens of your camera, which is also a projector, is that with cynicism, the thing that your frame pulls forward and makes really sharp in focus is any possibility that someone could be taking advantage of you. That becomes the focus. So anytime you're interacting with someone, if you're cynical, you're looking for how could they be trying to get something out of me? And that's in sharp focus. And then things that are just not related to someone trying to take advantage might be entirely outside of the frame. That's how I would think about cynicism in terms of this lens framework. Now, it turns out that it's not possible to get rid of your left hemisphere. It's not possible to not have maps and not have projectors. So if the cynic has a particular map, are other people's maps better? Or why are other people's maps better able to see reality? And part of this is this thing I'm going to talk about later about how the left hemisphere and the cynicism will chase away reality, chase away the most beautiful parts of reality. That's part of it. But then we have to ask the question, what does a better map look like? How does a person use their right hemisphere to make their maps better? And I talk about this by talking about the reality sandwich, where the appropriate way to use this is to start out with the right hemisphere, where the right hemisphere can perceive reality. It looks at an individual situation, an individual person, an individual context, everything you know about that person from your past relationship with them. It can perceive those things apart from the map, mostly. And then based on that, you take that information to your maps. And in interacting with your map, you might try to adjust to the situation, try to learn something new. But then after you've done that, after you've done the interacting with the map, then you take it back to the reality part that the right hemisphere can perceive. And the problem here, I realize, is this makes it seem like, why don't you just rely on only the right hemisphere and just look at reality all of the time? And the truth is, you cannot remove your lens. Your lens is super glued on. And even your right hemisphere, it does pay a type of attention to the world where it can perceive things that are not on the map. But it will be easier and faster to perceive things that are on your map. And things that are really far outside your map, it may not be able to perceive even your wonderful right hemisphere. So the fact that your lens is super glued on means you need to be careful and you need to interact and update your maps and make your maps more flexible as you go through life. And bringing this back to the cynic, we have a situation where the non-cynic is going to constantly be updating their map such that their real life experience builds their map into something that better and better reflects reality over time. Whereas the cynic's map, it doesn't update as quickly because it has this sort of fixed way of projecting onto people. And of course, I've argued that building up maturity into your maps involves building flexibility and ambiguity into them. It involves acknowledging that people aren't all self-seeking and all trying to take advantage. They're not all loving. They're not everything's wonderful and people have no ulterior motives. Most people have many different motives driving them that sort of come up at different times based on the context, based on the particular people they're interacting with, based on a lot of things. And thinking about people in a way that holds the ambiguity of those multiple drives in a person is the best way to ultimately perceive what is going on in a particular situation. Is this particular situation a time I need to be more skeptical or a time I need to be more trusting? And really, honestly, both of those have risks with them. So there is an inherent vulnerability to the kind of ambiguity you need to have flexible maps. So how does manipulation work? And how can we think about cynicism in the face of manipulation? And I think there's 3 different ways manipulation can operate, where the first is by operating through the map. If someone wants to manipulate you, one approach would be to whatever they're trying to channel you toward, whatever behavior they're trying to get out of you, put that inside somebody's map. Understand their map, understand how well it works, and make it seem like what they want you to do is right in the middle of what their map is telling them to do. And if there's something you don't want them to do, make sure that appears to them as if it's totally outside their map, or even better, as if it's in somebody's map that they perceive to be an enemy, they perceive to be an outgroup. And if you can do that, you're using the person's map to manipulate them. I think that's, in some ways, one of the biggest ways of manipulating people is through this map mechanism. And then the second way is going to be through arrogance and ego, that the manipulator figures out how doing the thing the manipulator wants feeds the ego and makes the person feel better and smarter and more generous and more giving than the alternative. And the manipulator can frame the thing they don't want the person to do as a threat to the ego somehow. And then the third lever of manipulation is going to involve emotion and channeling emotion in certain directions. And that's beyond the scope of this video. Other than I want to point out, oftentimes the means for manipulating emotion does have to do with manipulating people's maps of the world. So let's complete the logic here. How does this mean that someone who's cynical is easier to manipulate, or in other words, more gullible? And it's because cynical people have a really predictable map, where that map is going to draw forth any possibility that someone they're interacting with could be trying to take advantage of them. And they're going to magnify that and come up with all the reasons why that might be true. So someone trying to manipulate has a really clear pathway to manipulate them through that means. Now, I want to talk about why cynicism chases away reality. Because the basic idea here is if you're cynical and icky toward people when they share something beautiful and meaningful and profound with you, they're not going to share much more of that with you, because that's just a degrading experience to have something you find meaningful degraded in that way. And that means you will actually see less of that kind of thing because people won't share it. So the intuition you develop for how the world really works will be distorted in this way. People will share with you things that they're confident you cannot sneer at. But since you can sneer at most things, they may share less and less with you, and especially less and less things that could counteract your cynicism. So like, let's say you have this experience where you had a really bad day and you go to a park and somebody brings you a cake and they're like, hey, you just look like you needed a cake today, so I just wanted to give this to you. No thanks required, and they run away. That's just a really meaningful, beautiful experience about something that happened between you and that person. And if you share that with someone and their reaction is, oh, they were probably just trying to impress their girlfriend, if they sort of take away even the possibility that that could have been a beautiful thing that wasn't just somebody trying to get something for themselves, if you do that, there's something about that that degrades the actual experience. And of course you can be like, oh, that's them. It's their cynicism. It's not what actually happened. But even so, sharing it and having it shed with that light, or having that projector of cynicism onto that experience you had, does in a very real way diminish that experience. And on this point, I do just want to bring up the fact that oftentimes our cynicism is not a blanket cynicism toward everybody. Oftentimes the cynicism is toward an outgroup. And so if the in-group sort of gets the benefit of the doubt and you are allowed to have meaningful and beautiful behavior within the in-group, but every time you encounter the outgroup, you project onto them bad motives or whatever, you are actually going to get information coming to you from the outgroup that is biased toward the bad stuff, because those people will hide from you the good stuff that they share that you degrade. So this is one of the forces that is sort of driving in-groups and out-groups apart. And when I think of cynicism, I have this image in my head of a YouTuber whose YouTube channel is taking stuff that people consider to be sacred and sneering at them. So they like take Bach and they take people's appreciation of Bach as a musician. And their reaction is, if you actually look at the historical context for Bach, he had political agendas and he was just trying to create this music to make people feel something emotionally, to get them buttered up to accept his political opinions. They project this icky thing onto something that's beautiful. Or I imagine this YouTuber sort of going to videos where someone is like sharing a moment with their loved one at a sunset, and they've created maybe this sort of beautiful video about that experience and how the sunset represents their relationship or whatever. And this YouTuber does this reaction video sort of thing where they're like, this girl is literally taking light waves from the sunset and trying to make it as if that's about her and her husband. Like, you can always degrade people's beautiful, meaningful moments. robots. And cynicism, it does that. It does that through the type of attention it pays to the world. And in using that projector in that way, you end up blinding yourself to any reality that could be more meaningful. And I totally realize these examples are a little bit over the top, but I do think they kind of convey the idea. Now, I want to give an example here, and this example may seem kind of stylized or maybe even a little bit goofy, but I think this example will help us to see the relationship between growing cynicism in society and the direction the economy is growing, because I think there's going to be a feedback loop between the structure of society and growing cynicism, where one feeds the other, and it leads to this escalation of both cynicism and taking advantage, in other words, making people gullible to a certain style of manipulation that fits in with a cynical mind. And we're going to have somebody, the manipulator in this case, trying to sell people music teacher robots. And those music teacher robots are going to be robots that maybe can attach to a keyboard and they can ask your kid questions, where's a C sharp? They can have a metronome going and tell if your kid is playing according to the metronome. They can spit out all of these statistics about your kid's progress over time and suggestions for the next piece that your kid should be practicing and when they've mastered it according to some metric inside the robot's brain. And if the manipulator is trying to sell this, it's going to look at why might people not buy this thing? And one reason for that is they might prefer a music teacher, a human music teacher. So if you want to use somebody's cynicism against them, the frame for that is going to be to say that music teacher is trying to make money out of you. They're trying to take advantage. They'll probably raise prices on you after your kid loves the teacher. They're going to try to get your kid to sign up for everything and sell all of the books through them instead of you buying it individually. It's going to sort of lean into this skepticism that that person might be taking advantage. And of course, the robot doesn't have those human desires to take advantage of each other. It's just a tool, at least according to the marketing materials of this robot music teacher company. As a matter of fact, in our cynical world, there is a distancing from real human people who are enacting things in the economy toward this more robotic, go with the thing that doesn't have its own desires and its own will. And I think there is a general intuition people have that the robot itself is less manipulative than the music teacher. I think that has evaded into the minds, evaded into the intuition of people, many people in our society, in a way that parallels things that are happening all over the place. Like in healthcare, it parallels things happening in education and in just so many different realms. But here we're talking about manipulation, and we're looking at the manipulation from the perspective of the robot company. And actually, the robot company is trying to manipulate. It's just the point of manipulation is several steps removed from the human-to-human interaction. And I mean, I do think a lot of people would say, well, it feels worse to be taken advantage of by a music teacher down the street who you can look at their eyes and you can see, wait a second, that person who looked so trustworthy took advantage. That feels worse than being taken advantage of by somebody sort of high up in a system who doesn't know you, who's just generally taking advantage all over the place. That feels like it works better with the cynical mind. And taking this further with the salience frame aspect of manipulation, the manipulator also wants to make less salient, to move it out of the salience frame or maybe to the fuzzy edges, things that are on the side that it doesn't want you to look at. And so in this case, with our real music teacher versus our robot, what might that be? And it could be the actual advantage that a music teacher has, which is basically that music is a human thing. If you're learning to play music, this is not a mechanical thing. You ultimately want to be able to pour your emotions into it, to experience story through the song, to let your practice of the music interact with your mood. And even if the music teacher themselves, even if they're doing something that's kind of similar to the robot, There's still a mind that's experiencing what is the student's mood today as they play through this. And can I capture something that's unique and human through the way they're moving into this music? And it's those moments, it's that ability for that connection to happen from human to human between the teacher and the student that can build up the student's actual ability to eventually take on a style with the music that is unique to them and that is human and that actually captures the essence of music. And what does the manipulator do with that reality? It pushes that reality to the edge of the salience frame lens, so that that's not the important thing about music. The important thing about music is progress through the music books, is ability to know the notes, is ability to keep on the metronome and to keep up with the metrics inside the robot's brain. And anytime these parents have an inkling that their child might be missing something by learning music from the robot company could say, wait a second, you don't want to be taken advantage of by that person down the street, do you? And in the cynical brain, that will resonate. And I said this was a stylized example. And what that means is in the real world, the way this might play out could be, oh, the robot is so much cheaper. It's so much more efficient for your kid to learn music from the robot. There's so many advantages to that. So it will be about productivity. It will be about cheapness. It will be about things that sort of have the same effect as the overly exaggerated example I just gave, but they will be a lot more subtle. But they'll still operate on the back of this cynicism that is afraid of being taken advantage of, that feels more comfortable with things that are less personal because the personal can potentially at least have that element of manipulation or nefarious behavior. And here's one problem. Obviously, I think the right way to go generally is with a human music teacher. But when you look at those human music teachers, they are complex. They have many different motives for doing what they do. Most of them love children and love music and get something super meaningful out of that interaction with a child and out of the music they're playing. That's most music teachers. But they mostly also have to make a living. There are also these self-serving reasons that are sort of wrapped up in a way where the wheat and the chaff in the human soul are mixed together. You don't get perfect angel music teachers, you get human music teachers. And in looking at this, there are certain ways that a person may be trading in the possibility of not being manipulated by the music teacher for the certainty of being manipulated by something that's farther removed from the interpersonal. And even if we can kind of understand why this happens, there is a certain gullibility in that. The video is over, I'm just rambling, and some people ask about my accent, and it's actually not an accent. I grew up in Kansas City and then in southern Missouri, the boot heel of Missouri, and the boot heel has an accent, but it's not this one. This is really just the way I talk, and of course I'm a little bit more impassioned on this channel than I am in regular conversation, so it's not an accent, but I appreciate the way you appreciate the way I speak.